So I think that's really interesting. I think you'd struggle to find an organisation that has a deliberate strategy of trying to kind of balance deliberate bad press against the benefit of these kind of technologies. I think what organisations are failing to get right is understanding just how prevalent in the public consciousness issues around data privacy in particular, but also the way that AI uses individuals' data has changed over the last year or so. I think one of the things we've talked about before is how legislation like GDPR, although actually in practice hasn't really changed very much, has raised public consciousness of some of these kinds of issues. And what we're seeing is that organisations are failing to actually really engage well with individuals' need for understanding and transparency in the way these technologies are being deployed and the way data can be used within those organisations. Now, it can be very tempting for an organisation to go and see this massive data and all the potential for what we can go and mine from it and the analytics that we can get and the way that we can build very personalised services for people. But without understanding actually how that's going to impact people and what people want to know about how these data are being deployed, there's real risk. So I don't think it's a deliberate strategy, but I think we're going to see more and more instances of this kind of bad press if organisations don't step up and start communicating better about the way they're using data and using AI and advanced analytics. So I do agree with that assessment. I think it's very easy to talk about the changing nature of jobs in the face of technology. I think that's been a trend that as humankind we've always actually had, and that perhaps not all that interesting to look at because it's something that is just part of our everyday lives. I think there isn't anybody who wouldn't agree that computerization over the last 3 or 4 decades has utterly changed all of our working lives. And that sometimes people push to try and predict specific job roles that might exist in the future, but it's very hard to go and kind of crystal ball gaze and imagine what roles might exist. But it is true that the nature of the kinds of roles people are having are becoming more general. There was a report done earlier this year by Deloitte that showed that increasingly people are holding jobs for less time, people change jobs more frequently. And so what happens is people become more generalist in what they're doing. There's a phrase that has been starting to buzz around as specialist generalist, where people are taking quite specialist kind of roles but generalising in that they're stepping across industries and across sectors a lot more. Now that's a challenge for organisations that need to retain specialist expertise within their organisation. When their workforce is going to be changing more and more frequently, they need to find new routes to being able to retain their IP and their special processes and actually being able to deal with attrition in a whole different way, because they need to be able to upskill staff much more quickly when those staff are these kind of specialist generalists who are jumping between different roles. Now there's also, of course, a lot of the talk about the changing nature of roles tends to be quite technical. It tends to be, well, there's going to be more data scientists. I think it's quite obvious to see there is a big gap right now in the ability for organisations to hire for those kinds of quite technical, data-driven roles. But it's also interesting to look at how those kinds of data-driven roles are stepping out into fields that are not computer science-led. So I think we'll see a change in the role of the auditor becoming more data-driven, those sorts of things. But then imagining that these people are likely to be changing roles more frequently, organisations need to find ways of stepping up to that challenge. There's lots of initiatives, particularly government-led initiatives, things like the new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation that are putting some of this at the fore. I think the more that those kinds of initiatives are being talked about in the media, the more people understand the way that their data is being used. And actually, as we start to see some of these quite high-profile data breaches, that's getting reported on in the mass media, and people are starting to understand it in a whole new way. I think that gives us a public that actually are really hungry for transparency and understanding in the face of a complete lack of really strong legislation that can support them in other ways. And organisations need to understand what that means for them and for their customers. Or there's all kinds of ways. I think there's the new, I think it's called World AI or something along those lines, where Microsoft are investing a whole chunk of their money in using AI for looking at in particular environmental pressures. When you look at what a lot of these kind of machine learning and other statistical techniques can do, really it's about taking very large amounts of data and looking for trends. Well, on a global scale, those very large amounts of data, we have lots of data on weather. We can use IoT to do all kinds of interesting things. You can do very interesting image analysis that allows us to predict things like weather patterns, food security, those sorts of things that are very hard for an individual human to ever actually go and do. So you can see a future where we're using these technologies to help solve some of our future food security problems by better planning crop planting. You can predict extreme weather events with much more accuracy, so keep people safer more easily. You can use IoT and kind of quite high resolution advanced scanning alongside some artificial intelligence to do things like plan forestation, the deforestation, to plan the way that you should be planting trees in a whole new way to meet the challenges of extreme weather. I think it's very exciting. It is a big data challenge, and there are a lot of organisations stepping up to some of that challenge now. So I think we've seen a lot of AI experiments and deployments being about making smoother customer interactions, supporting customers better. A lot of it's been quite front-end focused. A lot of those organisations sit on data that can help them predict what's going on actually with their customers further down the track, kind of in the middle office or back office, as opposed to these being front office or customer focused tools that essentially is a lot of what's been being built. So I think a big pain point that these technologies have the ability to approach and solve if they're handled carefully, particularly carefully around the use of data and around the transparency of the way we're using data and making decisions, is that there should be the ability to go and proactively solve some of these problems before they ever reach the consumer. So you can imagine a world where actually we are more able to spot fraudulent transactions, for example, in imagine a credit card provider. Imagine being able to more timely spot a fraudulent transaction without ever having to block or stop the consumer's card, because we can predict it much sooner, because we're able to bring those technologies that have been successful at the end of the chain much further up along the chain. I think organisations, to be able to reach that kind of goal, have to be able to understand their data. They have to be able to step up to deploying some of these technologies at scale, and they have to be able to keep human oversight in what they're doing. They have to keep a human in the loop so that they can trust what they're doing. So I think a challenge, but also opportunity. I think in financial services, there is huge opportunity to get some of this stuff right, and we are seeing financial services starting to pay a lot of attention and be very interested in being able to do some of these things. So I think one of the really interesting things people look at, one of the trends we've seen is that people often think of machine learning and neural networks as being the same thing. Actually, neural networks are just one tool in a big set of different things that we broadly call machine learning, which then we more broadly call artificial intelligence. And I think one of the risks that exist is that people very often think that there is a silver bullet in using neural networks in particular to go solve some challenge, that actually you can go and throw a load of data at a neural network and it will go and solve all your problems. Of course, you can build neural networks that can solve for pretty much any problem, but a huge risk there is that you build systems that overfit, by which I mean that they can solve for a very, very specific challenge because you've trained them in such a way that they solve for a very specific challenge. Now, if you don't really understand why you're deploying these things in the first place, you have risk that you overfit all of your deployments, and that can be very dangerous. I think particularly in things like image recognition, there is a lack of understanding of how easily things like neural networks can be deceived. There have been some reasonably high-profile tests done just recently that can show with a bit of Gaussian noise over the front of an image, you can trick a neural network into recognising a dog as a cat or whatever it's been trained on as something very different. Again, that's not the fault of the technology, that's a misunderstanding of the way these things should be deployed in the first place, and an over-reliance on automated statistical approaches to go and solve for everything. That's a really, really interesting question. I think one of the things to recognise is that this is not new. What's different, I think there are two things that are different. One thing is just the scale of the problem, the scale of the ability to go and use personalisation and manipulation to target individuals. Recognise that this has been happening for decades. This happens without computers, but actually now this can reach a vastly bigger set of people. And what is particularly worrying is how it is becoming increasingly difficult to identify when it's happening. So it's becoming easier for malicious actors to go and target individuals or groups of individuals without anyone ever knowing actually that they're being targeted. And it's interesting to see organisations like Facebook and Twitter and the platforms on which some of this is happening struggling to actually really identify where this is happening, and having to have large groups of human experts go and trawl through posts to go and figure some of this stuff out. That is a super worrying trend, and I don't really know how you can step up and approach solving it.